I want to go back to rights. Back in 2019, all members of the chambers, every single MLA unanimously voted for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People 5 years ago. And I think it is outrageous that we are having this conversation to amend it. I think this rhetoric is all about, again, fear. And so why are we having this conversation? The conversation of Indigenous rights has been spoken about since time and millennia. We have been, as a First Nations matriarch, as a First Nations woman, I was born into politics. Everything about our well-being is about our rights. And I'll remind listeners that our rights are protected within the Constitution under Section 35, because a lot of work was done, a lot of advocacy was done to recognize our rights and affirm our rights. And so I hope that we keep coming back to the conversation about rights and start muting this rhetoric.
Well, what about the ruling that I mentioned that was just released on Friday? How significant was that court case?
Well, we live in a democracy. We live in a federal state, and we have checks and balances. I've heard Premier Eby speaking about possibly making amendments to the legislation, and that decisions should be made by members of the Legislative Assembly. And I think there's a role in our democracy for legislatures to have debate. But the Supreme Court of Canada has spoken. And if you look at my Twitter, I challenged John Rustad not too long ago to say, read the memo. Read the numerous court cases that Indigenous people have won in the courts time and time again. And so let's stop the rhetoric. We are going to waste taxpayers' dollars just for Indigenous people to have their rights upheld. That's the direction it's going. With Haida, with Cowichan, with Niska. I'm proud to be Niska, and the Calder case is one of those first cases to uphold and recognize our rights. And so to listeners, we really need to stop this divide and conquer and focus on unity and prosperity and really bringing people together and paddling together. So I almost had to do a double take when I heard that there was a discussion or even a sentiment that we are going to mess around with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Well, Trevor Halford was pretty pointy in the clip that we just heard there, but you also heard the Premier's comments that he's open to revisiting DRIPA. So he also addressed the First Nations Energy Summit today. I understand you were also attending that summit. So what message did you hear from David Eby?
Yes, the Premier did mention that they may be entertaining amendments to the Declaration, and I would strongly encourage all constituents to be reaching out to their MLAs to express their opinion. We live in a democracy, and I'd like to see the rights of Indigenous people moving forward. When we voted for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2019, that was a historic moment that I was very proud of. I was the first First Nations woman to ever get elected in 2016, to serve in cabinet in 2017, and if we amend these rights, we are going backwards. What guarantees do we have when we open up this act to tinker around with the rights of Indigenous people that we are going to have certainty that we're going to have more consent and more consultation? That's what the Supreme Court challenged, that there was not. There was a drive-by on the rights of Indigenous people when it comes to consent and consultation.
So at the Energy Summit then today, I mean, what was this the topic of the day? I mean, what were people saying?
It was one of the last questions, I have to say. And I know one of the people that asked the question, this individual, said it had to be said. We have to put it in this public forum. We're at an energy summit. We're talking about bringing clean energy and major projects to BC for prosperity. I agree with all of that. We all want prosperity, but not when we're trampling on the rights of Indigenous people. And with all due respect, Gloria, what worries me the most is the fear-mongering from the official opposition and what a circus it would be to see Trevor and his colleagues in the legislature making a mockery of Indigenous rights that we've fought long and hard for protecting. I've said time and time again, being Niska, we've been briefcase warriors coming to the table time and time again to defend our rights, and that's not going to stop.
Well, if the Court of Appeal has found that DRIPA is not compatible with the system to grant mineral rights, is it appropriate to modify the Act to address that in particular?
I'm not a lawyer, but what I can say is that there are enough lawyers that are paying attention to this at the moment, and I think they need to focus on rights and they need to focus on good, progressive public policy that is going to get to yes. I would love to see all sorts of energy projects happening in First Nations communities, but we cannot do drive-by consultations and trample on their consent. That just is not what is in line with what the Supreme Court has said.
No, and I think you're right about, lawyers looking after at the the details of this ruling and the potential impact. But if the province does end up amending DRIPA legislation, I mean, where does that put the province's ongoing reconciliation discussion, do you think?
I think if there are any amendments done to DRIPA, as long as it results in progressive public policy that advances a clear roadmap and blueprint for consent and consultation and working with First Nations and Indigenous people, then that could be a good thing. But I think there needs to be a very clear mandate on why they would open up. What is the rationale to open up the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? When it comes time to rights, our Charter of Rights and Freedom, if we don't agree with the courts, are we gonna go amend the Constitution every time we don't agree with a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada? That's not why it's there. That's why we have a Supreme Court of Canada, and we have checks and balances by elected officials and the courts. And Premier Eby did mention today, he's a lawyer. He respects the rights of Indigenous people. He respects rights. And I really, quite honestly, Gloria, I just hope that this is rhetoric and that good counsel, clear heads over the holidays recognize that we are not going to spend good, valuable tax dollars fighting First Nations people in the courts and amending a law that I think is only 5 years old and needs time to mature.
Melanie, the DRIPA conversation concentrates on this part of Canada. What do you make of the larger conversation right now, the push from the federal government to, let's talk about the Memorandum of Understanding with Alberta. Let's talk about the potential for a pipeline to the north and where First Nations people fit into that conversation. What are your thoughts about how all this has unfolded?
I think the formula is pretty simple. Getting to yes starts with consent and consultation. Where legislatures get it wrong is they leave that as an afterthought. They forget to go to nations after the fact, and that's what happened with the Gitxaala Nation. There wasn't consent and there wasn't consultation. So I, with all of my heart, would love to see the province here in BC and the federal government thriving and working alongside nations. I've always said paddle together, working together, but we cannot, we can't be asleep at the switch when it comes time to consulting with First Nations leaders. We pay in the long run. All of us pay as British Columbians. I'm a proud British Columbian. I'm a proud Canadian. I'm a proud taxpayer. And I hate to see this waste in the courts. It moves us backwards. And quite honestly, I know as a former elected official that constituents want to see governments working with First Nations people. They want to see unity, not divide and conquer. It's the oldest playbook.
Is there room for the government now to reach out? I mean, we've spoken to a lot of First Nations leaders here in British Columbia and saying, they've been uninvited to meetings and to conferences and that type of thing. And I don't know, is there room, do you think, to have those conversations?
As a former cabinet minister, I'd like to see the government arming the public service on having a better understanding about consent and consultation. It doesn't matter what project it is. If they're armed with understanding that this is a constitutionally protected right and understanding DRIPA, which DRIPA was supposed to do, it was supposed to evolve over time to bring laws in line with the rights of Indigenous people. So that's where I would be putting my attention if I were still elected, is to arm the public service with having better tools so that we don't find ourselves where nations are going to the Supreme Court of Canada saying, hey, you forgot something. It starts with the letter C, consent and consultation. So yes, I think we can get to yes.